We now begin with the first keynote speech, and I will hand over the proceedings to Norm Horofker, the moderator for this morning.
Good morning. My name is Norm Horofker, and I'm the minister of the Universalist Unitarian Church of Halifax, established 1837, in case you're curious. It's my honor this morning to introduce two key speakers and to moderate a short question period that will follow each presentation. Matter of business, I think we're trying to end the first session at 10 o'clock still? Yes, okay. So our first speaker is Dr. Ann Boyles. Born on Prince Edward Island. She's a published author and has a lifelong passion for writing and editing. I refer you to the bio for details. The passion that she has been followed in the academic world as well as the work she has done for the Baha'i faith tradition. Her address to us this morning is titled True Prosperity, the Role of Religion in Promoting the Material and Spiritual Well-Being of Humankind. I was sharing with Dr. Boyles this morning that I came here after living 17 years in the United States, and when I hear people talking about religion and material well-being, my mind immediately went to the idea of the prosperity gospel, which I think is a bigger deal in the U.S. than it is here. But the idea that God wants us to be rich, and all we need to do is follow the preacher and we'll become rich. And that's an interesting philosophy, but Anne assured me that's not her talk this morning. So Dr. Boyles, we all look forward to your message.
First of all, I'd like to say thank you to the organizers for inviting me. And I feel that yesterday was very rich, and I came away with many new insights about the different faiths that were represented yesterday. And I feel that a conference like this, it's like we hold a gem in our hands. And the gem has many, many different facets. And we look at the different facets and we appreciate the beauty of each one of them. And then we turn it and we look at another facet of the gem and we see how beautiful that facet is. And it's all part of the same gem. So today I'm hoping to offer a few insights from my own experience and from my own reading and studying. And I offer them with a sense of humility before all of you. And the first expression of that humility is that I changed the title of my talk slightly. I thought, how presumptuous to say true prosperity. I thought it's better to say towards true prosperity. So this is an aspiration. It's not something that's been achieved. And so I hope that you will bear with me as I go through my presentation. To begin, I'd like to take you to Vanuatu. An unlikely choice, but I'm going to take you there. For those of you who don't know, it's a nation that's composed of an archipelago of about 83 islands. They are volcanic, and it has a population of about 250,000 people, and it's located in the South Pacific Ocean. And I want to take you there on a particular date. The date I want to take you there is March 15th, 2015, the day after Tropical Cyclone Pam, which is generally regarded as the worst natural disaster ever to hit Vanuatu, passed directly through with winds that reached up to 250 kilometers an hour. And we are walking down a debris-covered road towards the village of Namasmatene on the island of Tanna. And as we look around, we see pieces of buildings and furnishings scattered everywhere, crops broken and flattened and uprooted. And when we reach the village of Namasmatene, we find that the entire village has been totally flattened. And surely, if there ever was a scene of material desperation and desolation and devastation, this is it. And yet, in the eerie quiet following the cyclone, we hear singing. And we see a group of youth who are starting to reconstruct a shelter. And farther along the road, we see another group cleaning trees, broken trees from the road. And still other youth are leading villagers back towards their destroyed gardens, and we hear them urging their elders to replant what has been damaged and to salvage what they can from further damage by the sun. These youth are promising to go with each family to help them with the replanting as a way to ensure that in 3 months' time, everyone in the village will have something to eat, enough food to survive. And meanwhile, we come across a group of 9 adults sitting in a circle in the rubble, and they're consulting about the reconstruction process. And their consensus is that they shouldn't sit still and wait for aid to arrive from a donor agency, that instead they should work with the villagers to take charge of their own development. What, you may ask, does this brief snapshot have to do with the topic of this presentation, towards true prosperity, the role of religion in promoting the material and spiritual well-being of humankind? Vanuatu is not generally regarded as a prosperous country, at least according to the generally accepted understanding of the word, which means, according to Webster's, financially successful. And by this definition, our view of Vanuatu limits us to a lens that's used by economists and statisticians who tell us that, for example, the annual GDP per capita hovers around $3,000, certainly at the lower end of the scale among the nations of the world, although well above the poorest of the poor, such as the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the annual GDP of which per capita was $231 in 2011. Nevertheless, compared to the richest countries of the world, such as Monaco, where the average annual income in 2011 was $171,465. So the contrast is very stark. And I think that we're all way too familiar with the kinds of figures that illustrate these extremes. We know that about 20% of the world's population use about 80% of the world's resources, that the wealthiest 1% of the world's people owns about 50% of all personal assets, and that about 1/3 of the world's people live on less than $2 a day. And we can find these figures in various places in well-published studies. And while this lens through which we look at countries in this way has its uses, and I'm not denigrating those uses, I say that it also restricts our perspective to a world where only a tiny percentage of the globe's inhabitants have achieved any level of prosperity, and the vast majority of people live in poverty. And of course, there are other thoughtful people who have begun to expand their view beyond this limited definition of prosperity as financial success and well-being, material well-being. And there are other indices that are being developed, such as the Human Development Index, the Gini Index, and the Gross National Happiness Index, on which, by the way, Vanuatu scores considerably higher than it does according to the GDP rating. So there are many others of these kinds of indices that are now used to measure various aspects of development and well-being of nations. But I think that we can come to an even fuller understanding of prosperity if we step back a bit further and we consider our basic purpose as human beings. As the teachings of all the world's great religions assert, we are more than creatures that are driven by material needs and desires, and our faiths tell us that our primary purpose as human beings is to know and love God. However we may define that creative force in the universe. Religious values, as Robin said this morning, have always served as a moral compass to humanity. They call us to look beyond the limitations of the material realm and to transcend them. And in that vein, I really hope that you will accept these few reflections on what the writings of the Baha'i Faith, the most recent of the great messages sent to humanity by an all-loving Creator, have to contribute to a spiritually based conversation on this topic. So more than 100 years ago, Abdu'l-Baha, the son of the faith's founder, described two calls to success and prosperity. One, he said, is the call of civilization, of the progress of the material world. And he described it as the trainer for the physical accomplishments of the world. And the other, he said, is the soul-stirring call of God, which he characterized as safeguarding the glory, the happiness, and the illumination of the world. These two, he said, must work in harmony with each other because the happiness of the world of humanity will only be achieved if spiritual qualities reinforce material achievements. And he concluded with this sobering remark. Progress and barbarism will go hand in hand unless material civilization is confirmed by divine guidance. And elsewhere, Abdu'l-Baha compared material civilization to the body, saying no matter how infinitely graceful, elegant, and beautiful it may be, it's dead. And then he continued, divine civilization is like the spirit, and the body gets its life from the spirit. Otherwise, it becomes a corpse. So I'll begin my reflections with the simple assertion that both material and spiritual well-being contribute to human happiness and true prosperity. Now, most people will agree broadly on the factors that contribute to basic human material well-being: freedom from war, freedom from disease, violence, and the kind of poverty that reduces people to desperate measures. In short, conditions that give us the freedom to live in such a way as to secure our basic human dignity. In fact, many of the international agreements that have been signed over the past century or so outline these conditions and have attempted to regulate their creation or their strengthening. But conversation about what constitutes spiritual well-being and coming to any kind of broad understanding about that aspect of our lives is less common and, as you've said, less accepted in many circles. But writing from his prison cell and from exile in the middle of the 19th century, Baha'u'llah, the founder of the Baha'i Faith, stated that the well-being of mankind, its peace and its security, are unattainable unless and until its unity is firmly established. In other words, without that condition of spiritual well-being, it will be impossible for humanity to achieve material well-being. And yet today, more than 150 years later, we find ourselves inhabiting a world still seeking desperately for peace, while at the same time thinking that we can worry about establishing unity sometime after that. Elaborating on these teachings of Baha'u'llah, Abdu'l-Baha spoke repeatedly about the relationship between unity and the advancement of civilization. And he traveled during the year of 1912, 1913 to North America and to the West. And during one of these talks that he gave in North America, he said this: "The supreme need of humanity is cooperation and reciprocity. The stronger the ties of fellowship and solidarity among men, the greater will be the power of constructiveness and accomplishment in all the planes of human activity. Without cooperation and reciprocal attitude, the individual member of human society remains self-centered, uninspired by altruistic purposes, limited and solitary in development like the animal and plant organisms of the lower kingdoms." Again, we see that the spiritual aspects of human life must be consciously and systematically nurtured for constructive change to occur on the material level. Otherwise, we see this kind of fragmentation that is evident in many aspects of our contemporary Western society's life. And as a contemporary writer and development thinker named Farzam Arbab has put it, the premise that Political and economic power, interpreted as advantage enjoyed by persons or groups, or as an attribute of individuals, factions, peoples, classes, and nations, used to acquire, surpass, to dominate, to resist, and to win. So the premise that that kind of political and economic power is the agent that will bring prosperity to the entire human race is untenable. Despite all claims to the contrary, there is no convincing historical evidence for this supposition. Practically, the elimination of the extremes of wealth and poverty, this elimination is one of the spiritual principles that was enunciated by Baha'u'llah, and it's essential to the foundation of a world economy that's characterized by justice. Abdu'l-Baha in one place referred to the true foundation of all economics as the love of God. He said to people again when he was traveling in North America, manifest true economics to the people. Show what love is, what kindness is, what true severance is, and generosity. Those, he said, are the foundations of true economics. In a statement to the peoples of the world that was written on the occasion of the International Year of Peace in 1986, the world governing body of the Baha'i community, the Universal House of Justice, observed this: the inordinate disparity between rich and poor, a source of acute suffering, keeps the world in a state of instability, virtually on the brink of war. Few societies have dealt effectively with this situation. The solution calls for the combined application of spiritual, moral, and practical approaches. A fresh look at the problem is required, entailing consultation with experts from a wide spectrum of disciplines, devoid of economic and ideological polemics, and involving the people directly affected in the decisions that must be urgently made. It's an issue that is bound up not only with the necessity for eliminating the extremes of wealth and poverty, but also with those spiritual verities, the understanding of which can produce a new universal attitude. Fostering such an attitude itself is a major part of the solution. Such an attitude transcends material concerns to address deeper, more pressing issues, particularly the way we regard each other. So let us then return to one of the foundational principles of the Baha'i faith that I mentioned earlier, and that's unity. Baha'u'llah said, so powerful is the light of unity that it can envelop the whole earth. It's a principle that's easily stated, but not so easily lived. How do we overcome long-standing prejudices to truly accept that we are all the fruits of one tree and the leaves of one branch? And yet such an acceptance is crucial to our continued existence and to our continued development. In 1995, the Baha'i International Community was invited to address the United Nations World Summit for Social Development in Copenhagen, which focused on this issue of development. And it related this issue, this key principle of unity, of overcoming prejudice, to social development. And it said this: the bedrock of a strategy that can engage the world's population in assuming responsibility for its collective destiny must be the consciousness of the oneness of humankind. Deceptively simple in popular discourse, the concept that humanity constitutes a single people presents fundamental challenges to the way that most of the institutions of contemporary society carry out their functions, whether in the form of the adversarial structure of civil government, an advocacy principle informing most of civil law, a glorification of the struggle between classes and other social groups, or the competitive spirit that dominates so much of modern life. Conflict is accepted as the mainspring of human interaction. And this represents yet another expression in social organization of the materialistic interpretation of life that has progressively consolidated itself over the past 2 centuries. Abdu'l-Baha stated repeatedly that religious, racial, political, economic, and patriotic prejudices destroy the edifice of humanity. As long as these prejudices prevail, the world of humanity will not have rest. Yet, however fragmented our current view, the yearning towards oneness remains. And indeed, during the era of the global village, it's an imperative. Each member of the human race is born into the world as a trust of all of us, an inheritor of the immense wealth of cultural diversity achieved over thousands of years. And this is vital to the social and economic development of a human race that is coming of age. If our collective continued development is dependent on the engagement and the participation of all peoples, on our overcoming prejudices and embracing our essential oneness, we can see one small example of the challenges before us reflected in a view that's still widespread in the development field, that sees the material poor as a bundle of problems and needs, as people suffering from malnutrition and lack of sanitation, as people with little education, living in inadequate quarters, lacking capital, with no access to modern technology, and unable to enjoy any reasonable level of consumption. And given that kind of attitude, how can aggregates of problems be expected to become active protagonists in development? It's not easy to understand. If we only see people who we regard as disadvantaged as being bundles of problems, how will they ever arise to become active protagonists in their own development? So again, this idea of a transformation, or the need for a transformation in attitude, becomes clear. There needs to be a giving over of paternalistic approaches that focus solely on considerations of material worth, and in the development work, an embrace of the moral and spiritual principles that come from religion. But religion that's willing to submit its proposals to the scrutiny of science, not a dichotomy. When we look at these two systems of knowledge, of science and religion, we see the complementarity of their spheres of influence. Science equips us to undertake a systematic examination of the world around us, and religion equips us with the moral basis to use the knowledge that we generate for the benefit of humankind. Ideally, then, both systems can work in harmony towards the material and spiritual prosperity of humankind, and can empower all peoples according to their capacity, the capacity of the peoples, to contribute to the generation and to the application of knowledge for the betterment of the world. The Baha'i teachings state, regard man as a mine rich in gems of inestimable value. Education can alone cause it to reveal its treasures and enable mankind to benefit therefrom. So clearly, there's a need for universal access to and generation of knowledge, a global education system based on grassroots participation and capable of building capacity to deal with the economic issues that we face. So rather than viewing material benefits and endeavors as ends in themselves, such an approach to education would tap into the knowledge systems of both science and religion, seeing material benefits as ways to extend the reach of human abilities, equipping people and institutions to lay the foundations of a new social order that can cultivate the limitless potentialities that are latent in human consciousness. So having said many conceptual things, now I'm going to try to return to the practical realm again. The Baha'i community has had some modest experience with approaches to building such capacities. And I'd like to conclude my reflections this morning by describing a few of them in the hope that it may further conversation on what's possible for communities of faith to foster in helping humanity to move towards a condition of true prosperity. The first experience that I'd like to mention is that of a non-governmental, not-for-profit organization named FUNDEAC, which is the acronym for Fundación para la Aplicación y Enseñanza de las Ciencias, or the Foundation of the Application and Teaching of the Sciences. And it was formed in Cali, Colombia in 1974 by a group of scientists and professionals who were concerned that accepted approaches to development didn't serve the population of the country's rural regions very well. And of course, this is a region that we've read about in the news as experiencing a long-standing civil war. And there was extreme cases of outmigration from rural areas, and urbanization was growing and growing. So this was destabilizing the countryside even further, and those farmers and those rural residents who were left were, in many cases, co-opted into working for the rebels and growing crops that were detrimental to the social well-being of their communities. So now this organization, FUNDEAC, which was formed in that matrix, has more than 40 years of experience in developing programs that are based on the kinds of principles that I've discussed here today. So I'll speak briefly about one of these main educational programs that's called SAT, S-A-T, or Sistema de Aprendizaje Tutorial. So it's a tutorial learning system. And it seeks to provide, and it has provided, high-quality secondary education to youth and adults in these rural communities. So what the organizations, what the founders of FUNDEAC found was that the accepted curricula and the approaches to education served only to impel youth and adults to leave their villages for urban settings. The founders of FUNDEAC developed a holistic education program that would equip them instead to remain in their rural homes and to contribute meaningfully to their own betterment and also to the betterment of their families and their communities. So they used flexible scheduling because many of these people who were participating were farmers and they had varying degrees of availability. And they decided that they would use relevant and applicable curricula. So while the standards of the program are quite rigorous, they used local materials and based the science modules, for example, on elements of science that would be useful to the people who lived in these villages. So while the principles were still very high-level, secondary quality educational materials, the context in which they were offered and the kinds of materials that were there were things that could be found in rural villages and used by the people to the betterment of their own communities. These people who were in the program were accompanied by local tutors who had gone through the program themselves sometime before. So this became a self-directed learning, so it's a tutorial program. So the students would gather in small groups and they would go through the modules, but there would be a great deal of self-directed learning in them. They would learn about the problems that confronted their communities, and they would integrate theory and practice, and they would integrate modern knowledge and traditional wisdom that they got from their villages. So they created a grassroots-based education program for people who would normally, if they had gotten to that stage in their education, either they would have dropped out of school and it would not have been available to them had they decided to stay in their villages, or they would have left for the city. As the FUNDEAC website states, the program strives to fuse together the intellectual dimension of the human being with its spiritual counterpart, a spirituality that is constantly reflected in the practice of universal human values and in the active participation in the search for and construction of a better society. The program, as you can see from this brief sketch, a really inadequate sketch that I've given of it, is very simple, but it's effective, and it has been, I guess it caught the attention of different people. It has won awards. It's gained recognition even from the Colombian government, and it has trained more, and this was some years ago, so the figures are probably greater now, but it had at that point trained more than 25,000 participants throughout the Americas. So it had been used in different countries that have also experienced war and disruption in recent years. It's a modest effort, and much more could be said about it, but again, I'm not an expert in this field, so I've tried to give you a brief sketch. And there are a number of similar other enterprises that exist throughout the world of varying degrees of complexity. Some are very simple in nature. Some of them are short-term projects that operate on these same principles, and then others are established organizations like Fundeac that have carried on work for decades. But I want to end this presentation, these few remarks this morning, by taking you back to where we began, back to Vanuatu. So let me first set the stage by describing the context of the snapshot that I gave you at the beginning. For some 20 years, since 1996, the Baha'i community of Vanuatu has been engaged in a systematic effort to build capacity in anyone who is interested and willing to join with it in a collaborative learning process that embraces children, youth, and adults. For the youngest participants, who are aged approximately 6 to 11 years in age, there are classes that further their spiritual education. They center on the building of character. They inculcate virtues such as kindness, generosity, and they lay the foundation for a moral structure that will be built throughout the individual's entire life. The second stage of the educational process is for youth in those challenging years of adolescence, from about 12 to 15 years of age. And this is the same program that Keon spoke about on the panel yesterday afternoon. The Junior Youth Spiritual Empowerment Program assists them, these groups of youth, to discuss important ideas, to form a strong moral identity while developing their power of expression and articulation and language skills. And they also develop and carry out service projects for the benefit of their community. And finally, the older youth and the adults participate in courses that enhance capacity for service, specifically by providing training for teachers of the children, animators of the junior youth, and tutors of the youth and the adult study circles. So the community pursues this training and the mobilization process systematically in 3-month cycles of action, reflection, and consultation. They reach out to attract others who may be interested for part of that period, and then they consolidate their work with the participants who have joined for the second part. And then finally, they reflect on their actions, and then they plan for the following cycle before they start the process all over again. And the concept is one of an ever-expanding, self-sustaining system of education that empowers all participants, young and old, to become agents of their own and their community's social and spiritual transformation. So the youth of Vanuatu, who have been studying and reflecting about the coherence between their own spiritual development and the transformation of the communities in which they live, have become aware that through their own actions, they have the power to affect the environment for the better. And they have developed the skills and the capabilities to take action, as well as the qualities and the attitudes that impel them towards that community-centered action. One of them wrote this after the cyclone: "For the reconstruction process, we will use the same tools and instruments that we used for the expansion and consolidation of our community. We will work in 3-month cycles. We need to ensure that both the spiritual and material aspects of our lives advance during the reconstruction process. The animators will be holding their animator gathering. The junior youth groups will hold their groups meeting and begin their service projects Their projects will encourage the community members to arise and take charge of the reconstruction process rather than waiting for an aid agency. Other participants used the skills and capabilities that they had developed in coordinating the work of the Training Institute to volunteer at the Disaster Management Office of the province where they lived. And practically, their intimate knowledge of the situation on the ground, their ability to do things like, very practical things like to collect statistics, to plan, to consult, to reflect, to write reports, to act systematically, all of these things that they had learned in this process in which the Baha'i community is engaged were beneficial to the relief effort in the 2 weeks following the cyclone, in particular, where things were in chaos. And further, they were able to actually help the many different aid agencies from various parts of the world who came to the island of Tanna, to Vanuatu, to learn how to consult together, to reflect together, and even to pray together. The experience of Vanuatu is dramatic, but the 3-stage educational process used there is part of a global grassroots education system, and perhaps you can catch a glimpse of how it has the power to equip participants to contribute to the building of a truly prosperous world civilization in which both material and spiritual aspects are addressed. It's a process that's unfolding in every corner of the world, in rural settings, in small villages, in towns, in large urban centers, in Vanuatu, in Halifax, in Charlottetown, where I live. It unfolds in simple huts or under shady trees, in community centers, and in comfortable homes. And in some places, the process moves rapidly, and in others, it moves more slowly. I'm not saying that it's easy. It's provided many challenges to the thousands and thousands of participating communities. But undeniably, the capacity to affect change is emerging as the protagonists of social change learn to apply with increasing effectiveness elements of Baha'u'llah's revelation together with the contents and methods of science to their social reality. So let me conclude these few humbly offered remarks to the conversation by saying that all of this instills in me a sense of hopefulness, that in the words of the Baha'i International Community, endowed with all the wealth of the genetic and cultural diversity that has evolved through the past ages, growing numbers of the world's people can begin to draw on that collective inheritance, and that we have seen they are ready to take up consciously and systematically the responsibility for the design of their future, a future that moves us ever closer to that condition of true prosperity for which we all yearn. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Boyles. She's agreed to take a couple of questions. We have limited time. The venue is lovely, and if you need to get up and have a cup of coffee or need to use the washroom or whatever, I think you can feel free to do that because our second speaker will be starting at about 10 o'clock. But in the meantime, do we have any questions?
Yesterday I asked you if you're happy, you said yes. And I know now you're happier today. This is a beautiful start. The meshing of well-being from the spiritual and economic perspective has been beautifully done, as was done in 1973. Small is beautiful. Buddhist psychology and Buddhist economics. You have brought in beautifully Baha'i economics and philosophy, and you made a powerful statement made by our keynote speaker yesterday, the first, and that the purpose of human existence is to know and love God. the same statement you came with. So today promises to be very beautiful indeed. In summary, quite quickly, economics make you a VIP. What's VIP? Very important person. Status, power, prestige, influence, gadgets, and so forth, very like the mafia. And then at the same time, spirituality also makes you a VIP, a virtuous, integrated personality. Today's personality is neither virtuous nor integrated because of the dominance of economic thinking. You have blended it beautifully, and I thank you for starting our day marvelously. The sunshine is about to come out indeed. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for your encouragement.
That was an easy question to answer, wasn't it? Are there other questions? There's something on my mind that I would like to ask you, if I may. In my short lifetime, when I'm thinking about material prosperity, I've lived through some major revolutions. The Green Revolution there was a time when the world was facing famine. If it wasn't for the way we've developed fertilizers and revolutionized our agriculture, as much as that brings a downside, it's been the salvation for many. And now, although the numbers are discouraging, the actual trends have been very positive. In the last few decades, the number of people brought out of poverty is amazing, but it's mostly happened in China, in India, in Southeast Asia, and it's mostly been because of the accumulation of capital and having markets and having a disparity between the rich and the poor, which kind of drives the system. But is it sustainable? That's the question, or that's the basis for my question. Is it sustainable? And I think what I see happening, and I see happening here in Nova Scotia, is people are turning for spiritual guidance to nature, to look at the world we live in and look at our rivers and our lakes and our forests and our fish and our animals and say, we have to take care of these things. And that's the one thing that may check our rapacious goal for material advance. So I'm wondering, how does that fit into Baha'u'llah's teachings? How does that fit into the Baha'i faith?
So you're asking specifically about relationship to the environment?
Yes, because I think that may be the only thing that saves us from our greed.
I think that Baha'u'llah, in his teachings, and the teachings of the Baha'i faith, says that we are stewards of the environment and that we need to take care of it. So the Baha'is have been, I think, very conscious of that. And many of these projects that have taken root in different parts of the world focus on safeguarding the environment. So a lot of them have to do not only with education, but education about how we take care of the environment. So I was talking about these junior youth groups around the world who engage in service projects. One of the first things, so I've had the opportunity, because of the volunteer work that I've done, to visit large numbers of these different groups and different communities throughout the Americas in particular. And one of the first things that these youth groups do, these kids who are between the ages of 11 and 15, so they come up with their own service projects to give to the community, to offer to the community. The first thing, almost invariably, that they decide they're going to do is pick up garbage. They understand that they should take a responsibility for cleaning up the environment. So that's one of the first things that they do. They feel very, very strongly about it, and some of the different camps that they attend and the texts that they study have to do with safeguarding the environment. So it's something that we try to instill an awareness about in the youth through this education, this grassroots education program, from the time that they begin it. I think that, again, the Baha'i community is a small community in numbers throughout the world, so the working with other groups to serve the environment or to safeguard the environment, I think for us is very, very important. But it is there, and it is part of what we're engaged in.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Oh, one other observation from our convener.
Norm, it leads from what you just said about growth in China and India. In the 90s, India adopted a capitalist structure of governance, and what we saw was, yes, India in terms of wealth paced right up the rung. And what really happened there was a capitalist structure only got the rich to get richer. Research showed that the poor got poorer instead. But while that happened, there were NGOs in India that were spiritually driven, who took a different tack to the whole thing, and set out to construct schools all over the villages, because you can't have a capitalist structure where literacy levels are very low. That began to change things, and in the last 15 or 20 years, the poor are being uplifted in India, and I think it was spiritually driven. A sense of caring and compassion is changing that, is creating the miracle.
Thank you very much. I think we take maybe one more question if we're going to. We need to stay on schedule, right? Checking with our convener.
Well, thank you for the very interesting speech. Actually, I have just a question, and you have to, excuse my ignorance. What is the historical context of the Baha'i faith? What is it? Is it a renewal for certain faith? What is it? That's my question. Thank you.
I'll give you a very brief answer because I know that we want to move on to the next speaker. But the Baha'i faith is an independent world religion, and its aim really is the recognition that all of the religions of the world are really different chapters in the same story. That it is all one religion, and that an all-loving creator has sent these different messengers at different stages in humanity's history to guide humanity from one stage of its development to the next. So we believe that this is a recurring event, that these different messengers who have come to establish not only their religions, but to advance human society, to advance the capabilities of human society. So we believe that the most recent of these messengers sent by God is a figure named Baha'u'llah, who came in the 19th century, and that his teachings all focus on two things. One is unity, and the second is justice. And he said that in order for the world to survive, we need to become unified. We need to recognize that there is one God, that religion really is one religion, that we are not in competition with each other, and that humanity is one family. So I think that's sort of the brief outline of what the Baha'i faith stands for.
Thank you very much.